There could be no feast without a fast, because how do you have these great feast days? How do we have Easter and Christmas? And what brings that true joy out is the fact that you've been going through a fast for so long. You have longing and you're there finally. If you don't have that, it's all the same. Like the secular world is going to have Christmas decorations up and everything's going to be Christmas until Christmas, and then it's gone, and then it's winter, and then you're just waiting for the next thing, and there's no highs and lows. It's all the same.
Be Jesus Christ. This is Father John Lovell with Hope in the Desert. We have back today the man who puts rad in trad, Matthew Plese, the Catholic CPA, who also runs the wonderful traditional blog, A Catholic Life, as well as the wonderful traditional catechetical program, a catechismclass.com. Excuse me, it's just catechismclass.com. There's no A with that. He's also the author of several books, including Restoring the Lost Customs of Christendom, The Roman Catechism Explained for the Modern World, and The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence. Matthew, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great now that I'm on the show. Thanks for having me again, Father. It's
Oh,
always
of
good to
course,
be back with you.
you're always very interesting, and I always tell people this is at the Rosebud Conference back in the glory days, you started your talk, and some might say, and I don't mean to say this in any negative way, some might say you have a very monotone voice, but everyone at that conference thought it was excellent. I heard no negatives. They were enraptured by what you were saying. And what you were doing was you were simply explaining what Catholics did in the way of fasting before the time of Leo the 13th. And now that we have Pope Leo the 14th, I thought it would be good to have you on to speak about Catholic fasting, the customs that we've kind of lost, specifically as we're approaching November and what is called St. Martin's Lent. But before we get into that, I listed a bunch of books that you've written. Did I miss any?
I think I probably have about six or so books out right now, but you hit the main ones. The main
The
one
main
I'm
ones.
most passionate about is the Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence. Now in its second edition. The second edition is over double the size of the first one. So many more years of research went into that, and we're going to talk about St. Martin's Lent today, and that's covered in extensive detail in the book. And I'm happy to say too that we're going to be launching the second edition in Spanish as well, God willing, in time for Lent. So if somebody did really want that, because it's unfortunate, but the Hispanic speaking world, while they have a lot of great customs and devotions for the faith, they lost fasting long before the English speaking world. So we're trying to also revive that too. So that will be available to everybody by the time Lent, God willing, comes around.
No, it's very good that you mentioned that because my producer Matthias lives just outside of San Antonio, and he is always wanting to cling to whatever Spanish custom he can, claiming that Texas was part of Spain at one time. I told him really a good chunk of all of North America was part of Spain at one time. At least they claimed it. So I don't know if
That's
that's
true.
necessarily a good reason to have the custom. But before we get into St. Martin's Lent, can you give us just a brief overview of Catholic fasting and abstinence from the time of the apostles, really up until the present age?
Wow, I mean that's a huge question as you know it, because our history is really one of fasting and abstinence, and we talk about them interchangeably, but they're really quite distinct. But what I've done over the years, and if somebody's interested, they can join in this effort. And it's the effort to actually live the life of fasting and abstinence. This is not just an academic exercise, and it's not just about abstinence on Fridays, which I would say is binding on everybody. It's talking about how do we live the way our ancestors lived long before, Leo the 13th? How do we live like the Middle Ages was, or even before? And if you look at it in that respect, you would take a calendar out, and if you would mark up the days as I do, and I publish this calendar too for people to use, if you looked at it, you would say 2/3 of the year is a day of abstinence and 1/3 of the year is fasting. So you're talking about robust amounts of fasting and abstinence. Abstinence would be on Wednesdays, on Fridays, and on Saturdays. throughout the year. You would have other long stretches of fasting and abstinence. That would be, for instance, Lent, obviously, the chief fasting period of all. St. Martin's Lent coming up before Christmas, another one. The Assumption Fast in August being another one. The fast leading up in June to Saints Peter and Paul being the Apostles' Fast. But then when you add the Ember Days, you have Rogation Day penances, you have Vigil of the Apostles and other vigils. It's a robust life of fasting. It's integral to living a Catholic life as going to Masses. So if you're not going about fasting and asking yourself, is today a fasting day? You're probably not doing it right because there's
And
so many opportunities.
we're filming this show the last week of October in 2025. I think a lot of people don't realize we actually have two fasting days this week. Monday was the vigil of Saints Simon and Jude, whose feast day was yesterday. And then Friday, Halloween, All Hallows Eve, was sadly finished even in the 62 calendar, but was a day of fasting and abstinence in preparation, not just for All Saints, but for All Souls and the octave of both, because they basically run side by side, the octaves of All Saints and All Souls. But we're approaching right now what many Americans don't realize is what was considered the Catholic Thanksgiving. The American Thanksgiving is relatively new. Abraham Lincoln instituted it in 1864 on the fourth Thursday of November. And to be fair, for a secular holiday, I think Americans in general treat it very solemnly. All right,
I would
I am
agree.
not I'm not opposed in any way to the American Thanksgiving, but there was a Catholic Thanksgiving that seems to have been thrown by the wayside. Can you speak about that? When was it? How was it celebrated? And what did it initiate in preparation for Christmas?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Father, I know you are familiar with this day, and that is the feast of Saint Martin of Tours on November 11th. That great wonder worker of charity. I think it's said that Saint Martin of Tours raised three people from the dead, and obviously, there's that famous story of him cutting off and giving part of his cloak to that poor man, and it turned out that that was Christ. And then keep in mind too, this was also when St. Martin of Tours was a catechumen. He eventually went on to become a bishop, but he was a catechumen and he was in the army for a long period of time. And that charity that he lived and embodied was so important. He's one of really the first great saints that we had in the church who was not a martyr, and his life was quite extraordinary. And for a long time, people observed that day as Martin Mass. That is a Catholic Thanksgiving Day. It was the great festival day of celebrating the life and charity of St. Martin de Tours. And the interesting thing, too, is the customs you would find associated with that day, especially if we're talking about children. And if you're in a household with children, you're trying to embody Catholic values to them. And children really latch on to customs, whether it be Christmas trees or whether it be certain kinds of food throughout the year. They really remember that. And that really stays with them more than, the discussion we're having here today. And in the past, St. Martin of Tours feast day was associated with lanterns. So in the evening, you as a family would make these lanterns and you would carry them around, and it was really symbolic of your light of charity shining for others. And I know just a few families who keep that same custom, but that is something that would be an excellent idea to do with family. Decorate the home with lantern and lights and celebrate the festival of St. Martin of Tours. And people generally in the past enjoyed this day primarily by eating goose. That was the main food to be had this day. And they would also drink St. Martin's wine, giving thanks for the harvest and keeping in mind that this was a day of joy, of feasting, of harvest celebration, of thanksgiving for St. Martin of Tours. And unfortunately, over time, that kind of went away. It kind of fizzled out. And then now we associate November 1st with Veterans Day, or as some people might still remember, Armistice Day. And what's interesting was that that day was put in place by Woodrow Wilson, who was vehemently anti-Catholic. And he really, some people almost looked at it as a way for him to cover up St. Martin of Tours' feast day, to get rid of any Catholic influence, because he was such an anti-Catholic himself. But what we can do is we can observe St. Martin of Tours' day. We can have goose or something like goose. We can have that carrying of lanterns, and we can remember his life of charity with others. And your second point was it's also very much a second Mardi Gras of the year. So it's a Thanksgiving of harvest, but it also inaugurates the beginning of St. Martin's Lent. It's that last day of feasting, of celebration, before we begin that 40-day period traditionally of fasting. And I say traditionally too, because this is something a lot of people don't realize. They think traditional means 1962, maybe they mean 1954, maybe they mean 1917. But when I say traditional, I mean we're going back centuries because this tradition fizzled out. But it is the traditional beginning of that period of fasting, that Advent fast of St. Martin's Lent leading up to Christmas.
And I just want to add, we're both Chicago boys. Um, there is a town about 3 hours west of Chicago that both you and I enjoy visiting called Galena. I lived there for a while. I consider it my adopted hometown. And they, without even knowing it, have kept a St. Martin tradition you mentioned about the wine alive. It's called the Nouveau Weekend, where they basically, Galena Cellars, the winery out there, releases the vintage for that year. It's a very new wine. And it's a French tradition. If you think of table wine, Beaujolais, Gamay, these were the types of wines that are best drunk when young. And it was celebrated that here is the fruit of the harvest that is coming out. So a lot of times people don't realize that a lot of these traditions around Martin Mass and around St. Martin's Lent, all right, still live on. Okay, you talk about lanterns. Well, what did that get turned into? A jack-o'-lantern. Okay, it got moved up to Halloween, where now they're making jack-o'-lanterns out of pumpkins. All right, and you and I had a wonderful Martin Bass dinner last year,
Yes, we
and
did.
our host got little lanterns, real lanterns, and put them
Hmm.
around the table, and it just added a wonderful mood to the entire festivities. And I think that what Catholics need to realize is, yes, we can still celebrate Thanksgiving, and we should. And I think you would even say that if you wanted to follow St. Martin's Lent, that a day that you could not follow it would be Thanksgiving, the American Thanksgiving. But I think
Hmm.
as Catholics, we need to get back, not just as American Catholics, just as Catholics as a whole, to getting back to reclaiming our customs. It's not just
Right.
going to the traditional Mass. It's about
Hmm.
reclaiming these customs because, as you said, children cling to those things. And I know so many families, young families, students that I taught that now in their 30s with young kids, they don't know what to do. And that's one of the reasons why I loved your book about the customs, the restoring lost customs of Christendom, because it reminds people of how important it is for fasting. And if I could make another point, is that what a lot of people don't realize is that up until the time of St. Gregory the Great, the East and the West churches were in lockstep with each other when it came to
Hmm.
fasting and abstinence. And the East still takes very seriously. They don't call it St. Martin's Lent. They don't even start the day after
Right.
Martin
Right.
Mass.
They call it
They
Saint
start a few
Philip.
days. Yeah, they start a few days later. Philip and James fast because that's when they celebrate, as we would say, Pip and Jim. That's when they celebrate their feast day, and they mark that as the 40 days. And
Hmm.
what's interesting is that if you talk to a regular Orthodox person on the street, something that you and I could easily do in the city of Chicago, not necessarily easy to do anywhere else in the country, is they don't even associate 40 days with Lent anymore. They associate the Advent with 40 days because they've kind of merged Septuagesima, the pre-Lenten season, and Lent together. For them, it's just one big season now, and they don't necessarily, at least the man on the street, doesn't realize that there is a difference with that. What do you think, as Catholics, especially those that are trying to live a traditional life, how should they start building up not just customs but fasting and putting that into their life? Because, and before I let you answer this, there are a lot of times during the year, and you just mentioned you put together a calendar that people
Hmm.
can follow, and please send us a link for that. We'll make sure to put it in the show notes. Is where they should begin because we have a lot of fasting days. I mean, if you think about the St.
Oh yeah,
Michael fast, the fast leading up to the Assumption, there's a lot of fasts. And if you think about it, if one were to do all of it, you'd be spending probably over 300 days a year fasting. And I think that would be a little too overwhelming, at least at the beginning, for most Catholics. How
for
should they
sure.
begin?
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent question, Father, because when so many people are getting into the faith and they want to do more and they want to really go further in the faith, they might bite off too much. And you know as well as I know how much I like running, how much I enjoy marathons. That would be the equivalent of somebody going from nothing to I'm going to run a marathon this week. And you can't do that. You're going to fail. You have to ease into it. So easing into fasting is just going to be so important. And part of what I did over the years is I created a fellowship. I think you're familiar with this, the Fellowship of St. Nicholas that I created with
Yes.
1 Peter 5 and a few other organizations because I wanted to give people, one, a framework for when to fast and how to fast, but two, a community so that way you knew you were doing it with other people and you had their support, their encouragement, their resources, etc. So when we did that, we launched it into three different tiers, and that's kind of I still think that's an excellent way for people to ease into fasting. So, for instance, if you find yourself aware that you have not been fasting much, what I would encourage you to do to start is, well, first of all, obviously no meat any Friday in the year for abstinence, of course. And I would say no meat throughout all of Lent, from Ash Wednesday until Holy Saturday, inclusive. And then as well, no meat on various Ember days and certain vigils like Christmas Eve or Halloween or the Vigil of the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption. All of those would be, I would say, minimum, as well as fasting for the entirety of Lent and the Ember days, and a couple key vigils throughout the year, like Halloween or the Vigil of the Immaculate Conception or Christmas Eve. Those are all going to be things that kind of take the 1962 Missal and the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and we can take that as a minimum. You might be shocked to say I take that as a minimum, but I really do. Because if you look at the history of the church, it's so much more robust than that. But that is very possible. I mean, even our grandparents' generation did that, and they did manual work in it. And sure, it was hard, but they did it, and it is supposed to be a sacrifice, but it's certainly very doable. But then after you kind of get that down, the next thing I would say would be to add on to that no meat any Saturday of the year unless it's like a first class feast or a formal or recurrent holy day of obligation, as well as for Lent, I would say not just abstinence from meat, but abstinence from all seafood, all eggs, all dairy products, because Lent was a vegan fast for centuries and centuries. And I would also say absence on minor and major rogation days, as well as absence all of St. Martin's Lent. So that would be November 12th until Christmas Day, basically having no meat at all, with exceptions for Sundays or the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, unless it falls on a Friday. And I think in the United States here, we would make an exception for Thanksgiving Day itself. That it'd be okay to have meat at that. So that's just some practical application of that. And for fasting, obviously, again, we're talking about fasting the entirety of St. Martin's Lent, except for Sundays as of days of fasting. That's what I think the next level would be. And to the final level, I think really when you get to that point of the calendar I make and you're trying to live out everything that our forefathers lived out, it would be everything that I just mentioned plus absence on the remaining vigils. Even the vigils, for instance, of the Purification of Our Lady, February 1st, or the Vigil of Corpus Christi, not liturgical vigils celebrated in the Missal, but still days in which the Church has encouraged fasting or even has indulgences for fasting on those days, as well as fasting on the Vigil of the Apostles, as well as the Assumption fast in August. And to that, I would also say, the fasting for the Apostles' fast in June, as well as the last remaining vigils too. So that's kind of getting you to the final tier. But you see, you don't have to go all the way in. You don't have to say I'm going to fast 1/3 of the year and abstain 2/3 of the year. That might be the ideal. It's the ideal I try to live, but it literally took me 5 to 6 years to get that way. So literally anybody can fast. You can do it unless a doctor has literally told you you are unable to fast. What the church requires in fasting is just one meal a day. So delay that meal, have it later in the day, have it in the early evening, preferably after sunset in Lent. All very possible for most people, but some people just think they can't do it because they feel hungry and think that they don't understand these feelings and they're like, I'm in pain, I'm not well. You're just really hungry. The body is not used to in America to be hungry because we live such a life where you're always eating and you're always consuming things and you're usually consuming processed things which therefore make you hungrier. You're never satiated. So, actually eating simpler foods, going back to a simpler diet, is not only just good for the soul, it's good for the body. So, I found that to be very beneficial to myself as well. So, I very much now look forward to fasting. You know, as the rule of St. Benedict teaches, one should love fasting. And of course, he's talking to monks there, but I think that that same adage can be true for us. Hopefully, you love going to Sunday Mass or you love going to daily Mass. At the same vein, you should love fasting because it actually gives you a means to become holier. Because the average person can't say Mass or hear confessions or go around baptizing people or even teaching catechism without proper training. But the average person can certainly pray and fast. And in fact, our Lord himself says that some demons are driven out only by prayer and fasting. So those are really indispensable to the life of every single Catholic out there.
And not only that, but John Henry Newman, who will be declared on November 1st a doctor of the church, he even said that the two wings that get us to heaven are prayer and fasting. And, what's sad is that in the modern Novus Ordo lectionary, that quote that you just gave from Christ, they've left out the word fasting. And if you read the reading, all it says, at least in the American lectionary, it says it's fasting. And I find that quite troubling. I want to get back to the length of fasts, how Lent is different from any other fast. But before we do that, tell us a little bit more about the Fellowship of St. Nicholas. Why St. Nicholas was picked? Why not St. Martin? Why not St. John the Baptist? What are the saints that are known for penance? St. Nicholas is known for giving gifts out and for punching Arius. I mean, don't get me wrong, commendable things to do. But why St. Nicholas? And tell us a little bit more about that fellowship.
Yeah, so we chose Saint Nicholas. That is not Saint Nicholas of Tolentino, who was a great faster himself, but we're talking about Saint Nicholas of Myra, that great bishop who did famously or allegedly punch Arius in the face, known for gifts and charity. And we chose him for a few reasons, one of which was that he abstained very strongly his entire life. In fact, if you I don't know if you recall offhand, but in the Roman Breviary, there's a line from him on his feast day, which mentions that even as an infant he did not nurse on Wednesdays and on Fridays, because those were days of absence and fasting. So even as an infant he did, and throughout his entire life he gave into quite severe absence. So that's one of the main reasons we picked him, to show you that you don't have to be, for instance, a St. Francis of Assisi going to an island and eating just half a loaf of bread all of Lent, and that was what you had to do. In fact, we had somebody who exemplified charity, going around doing all these great charitable works, and his charity shining before others, and he still found plenty of time and energy to fast. So that's one of the key reasons we chose him as our patron, because of the life he lived and how it really is indispensable from the life of charity to give into fasting and abstinence wholeheartedly. So that's why we chose him. We launched this fellowship several years ago, really around the time I launched my first book. And as I mentioned, I'm in the second edition, and this is what it looks like, The Definitive Guide to Catholic Fasting and Abstinence, second edition. We talk about the fellowship in here too, because when you're learning about fasting, you might be overwhelmed. I mean, I kind of went through a significant amount of research to put together things, many of which had never been put together in one place. In fact, there are a number of resources I found that actually had incorrect information on fasting. I reached out to publishers, even very common ones that you and I would both know, that had incorrect information in hand missiles, and I'm happy to say they've since reprinted with correct information because of the research that I sent them. But
Well,
that
there's
just to
not
show you
only,
there's so
if I
much
don't
out
mind,
there.
if you don't mind me interrupting, uh, uh, the length of time between your first edition and your second edition was very short. You even yourself discovered, as you kept delving more information, that you realized you had to get a second edition out there sooner rather than later. Correct?
Correct, correct. And I also, in the second edition of the book, I really looked at it not just from an American lens, but from the lens of other countries as well. So, for instance, we were talking about Spanish or fasting and absence and their impact on the New World. That is covered extensively in the book. And for instance, I even take the Philippines. You wouldn't think of that as a Hispanic country, but they were governed by Spain for a long period of time. And I even go over all the complex rules there. We won't talk about them here, but rules differed so much in time that your fasting days were different depending on if your parents were natives or if they were Spaniards, or if one was a native and one was Spaniard, you were different. So it's quite interesting really when you delve into that. And I know you like history too, to see how the history changed and evolved. And but the point is, while it's all very interesting to learn it, it has to be lived. So that's why the Fellowship of St. Nicholas exists. If you go to 1peter5.com/fast, that's all the information on the fellowship with the kind of the tiers I talked about, as well as at the bottom a link to a Telegram group, because people are always trying to support one another, learn from one another, be reminded when fasting days come along. There's really a lot out there when it comes to living the life of fasting and absence. And Father, I know that you personally have lived many of these days often now throughout your
Mhm.
priesthood. And I'm sure you've also found it incredibly enriching and helpful in your own spiritual life too, and in your physical life. So I hear from many different people from all walks of life, parents or individuals or younger people or older people, saying that the life of getting back to traditional fasting and absence is highly beneficial to their spiritual life. I mean, I don't think I've ever asked you, but I think it would be interested if you said something too about how it has impacted in a positive way your priesthood and how more priests should possibly fast more.
Well, no, and you're absolutely correct, and that kind of leads us into the next topic is we now live in a society where intermittent fasting, okay, is the rage, okay? Doesn't matter if you're religious or not, people are telling you go 16 to 18 hours without eating, okay? And I can tell you, as one who is getting closer to old age than young age, I'm really right in the middle. If you kind of consider what middle age is 45, if you're able to get to 90, that that's a long life. It might not be in 45 years. We keep extending that. I remember when I was a kid, people, passed away in their 70s, and we said, well, they had a good long life. Now people pass away in their 70s, and people go, wow, it was such a short life. Um, but I can tell you that intermittent fasting is almost a way of the secular world kind of telling the Catholic world, you got to get back to what you were trained for. And again, we're gonna. You said this earlier. We're gonna give the caveat that this should be done by adults with their physician notice. And as I tell a lot of my close friends, all right. I think if you said to your doctor, "Hey, I want to cut out processed food and red meat," they would probably stand up and cheer. All right,
Right.
that is nothing but a good thing, and eating healthier. As a priest, I can tell you spiritually, it makes me long for the Eucharist, not just on a spiritual level, but on a physical level. And you and I have talked about this of the importance of the Passion Tide fast, of
Hmm.
going up at Easter, okay, being so hungry that the Eucharist becomes not just nourishment of the soul, which is its primary purpose, no doubt of that, but it's just even your body is to the point of aching for that nourishment, which is that. And once people start to realize that I should try to maintain the midnight fast as best as possible. I
Hmm.
should the Eucharist should be the first thing that I receive, not coffee, ladies and gentlemen, but the Eucharist. All right, is that should be the first thing I receive in the morning, whether it's daily or whether you only go on Sundays. I think that's very important that we kind of get back to that. Yes, there are times that I understand this, especially in the traditional world, where you might not have the traditional mass until the evening. All right, well, thank God for Pius XII and giving that a dispensation for only 3 hour fast. But even to do that, because it's pathetic. It's pathetic in this day and age what the church requires. And I always like to say it's the first world laughing at the third world, all right? Because think about this. What is the requirements for fasting now? 2 days a year, Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. And they're basically saying you have one full meal, and then you could have two smaller meals that don't add up to a full meal. Well, if you think about that, isn't that the regular Italian diet? You know, I mean, the Italians have an espresso for breakfast, maybe a roll, okay, and that's it. Then they have a big meal at lunch, all right, and then they eat very little at dinner, all right. And if you think about this, in the third world, they would be grateful if they could get on a daily basis one regular meal and two smaller meals. All right,
Hmm.
they would be overjoyed by that. And so I want to kind of delve a little bit into why is St. Martin's Lent? Why is Advent? All right, different from Lent. In fact, we were talking about all these different vigils, rogation days, uh, the only thing that really comes close to the Lenten fast would be the Ember Day fasts. And
Hmm.
so, how is the Lenten fast different than other fasting, in your opinion? And how is it that St. Martin's Lent and Advent is actually a good preparation for Lent? Because a lot of people don't realize this. The time between Christmas and Septuagesima, depending on the year, is not that far. It's only a few weeks. And why
That's
St.
true.
Martin's Lent would be a good preparation for Lent and the importance of Lent.
No, that's true. I mean, even in some years, I feel like the 40th day of Christmas is running right up to or into Septuagesima. So you're really talking about, was it just a few years ago? It was like no border, actually. I think a Candlemas was in Septuagesima.
And
So
I think this year coming up is the same way. I think
is it?
Septuagesima
Okay.
begins the Sunday before Candlemas this year. I could be
Wow.
wrong, but I think it is.
Yeah, but that's a good point. But we'll get to that in a second. So, as of the Lenten fast, and sometimes we refer to that as Great Lent, because some of these other main fasting periods, when I don't mean Ember Days, I don't mean vigils, I'm talking about these fasting periods. Some of them are actually called Lents. So you have Great Lent, what we would call of Lent before Easter. Then you have this Advent fast. St. Martin's Lent is a Lent, just like the Assumption fast in August, as well as the fast leading up to Saints Peter and Paul, known as the Apostles' Fast in June. These all might be called Lent in some texts. So when we're talking about how Great Lent is different, it's not even just my opinion, because you asked what my opinion was. If you look at the Summa, St. Thomas Aquinas even says at his time how the Lenten fast was different than every other fast. Because in the very early church, when we're talking about fasting and we're talking about abstinence, we have to keep a few things in mind. For them, and actually for a long time afterwards, if it was a day of fasting, it was by definition a day of abstinence. There was no such thing as partial abstinence, which was invented in the 1700s and is written in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. That didn't exist. It was a fasting day. There's no meat allowed. Okay, so it's complete abstinence by definition. But that doesn't mean every day of abstinence is a day of fasting, like we think about Fridays throughout the year, but every day of fasting is a day of abstinence. So that was done in the early church. Um, Also, when we talk about fasting, it's not just how much we eat. You're talking about that one meal. But for a long time, fasting also meant when you eat. So, for instance, if it was a day of fasting, you had to eat after sunset. And that's how the early Christians practiced it. It was a vegan diet. It wasn't just a vegetarian one, it was vegan, and it was done after sunset. And as time changed and we had the weekly fast of Wednesdays and Fridays, basically turned just into abstinence, and then Wednesdays went away, but Friday abstinence remained, and we had other fasting periods too. Lent itself kept that rigor of the early church, where it was vegan, and it was a meal, one meal, had in the evening after sunset. So St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, in the Summa, he's talking about Lent is a vegan fast. That is why for a long time there's no eggs allowed, there's no dairy, there's no seafood even allowed. People think about fish and associated with Lent. You're talking about for hundreds of years there was no fish allowed during Lent. So that's why I highly encourage all people to eventually get back to having a vegan Lent, because that's quite penitential to go vegan, especially when you understand even Sundays in Lent were days of abstinence. That's another way how Lent itself was different. So you're talking about 46 days of no meat whatsoever, or no dairy, or no egg. That's also why we have customs like Easter eggs that have been retained, and people kind of forget why we have them now, because eggs are pretty awesome. And when you don't have them for 46 days, then you really look forward to them. So you decorate
Yeah.
them and everything, and you're happy to have them.
And if I may interrupt, the East still does this. Okay, I mean the Orthodox laugh at us. All right, they laugh at us because their Lent is still vegan. All right, and I always tell people it's hard to do a vegan Lent. I've done it. It's not easy. And again, it's like running a marathon, as you said. You need to practice at it. This is one of the reasons why St. Martin's Lent is so important. And you're right. Sundays in Lent were still considered abstinence. And the great Father John Zulsdorf, Father Z, he said this now over 10 years ago on his blog, and it's true because so many people think that Sunday is the day where they don't have to follow what they're giving up. Okay, that they're allowed to splurge, because every Sunday is the resurrection, which is true. Every Sunday is a mini Easter, that is true. Okay, but they think that no, we don't have to do this. And Father Zulsdorf said this, and he's right, Father Z. He said, "Let Lent be Lent." And we have to realize that yes, you don't have to fast on Sundays, but you should still abstain. Okay, you should still try to keep to that vegan diet, or at least what St. Gregory the Great says when he reformed the Roman Church, at least stick with fish and not with flesh meat, all right, or mammals and chickens and birds, and the importance of that. And yeah, and again, people forget we were talking about this earlier. The customs. What did peasants eat outside of Lent? Eggs and rabbits. Hence the Easter bunny. Hence eggs. I mean, imagine this. The first meal that you have as a peasant, you're not getting goose. You're not even getting turkey. All right? You're getting eggs. That would be considered a prime meal to the common peasant of France and Germany and England in the Middle Ages. You'd be lucky to eat rabbit on a Sunday. All right? And don't get me wrong, I love rabbit. It's delicious. The only rodent I eat, but it is very, very good. Um, and we have to keep that in mind. But I think it also, and we have to realize this as well. All right, when we like to say things like, where the Catholic sun doth shine, there is always laughter and good red wine. At least I've always heard it so, Benedicamus Domino from Hilaire Belloc, is that's coming from a culture that knew how to abstain, that knew how to fast in order to make those treats feel so much better. I think it was G.K. Chesterton, and I could be quoting him wrong, that said, Catholicism is a good steak, I think a good glass of wine, and a good cigar. All right. Well, again, that's coming from someone, even though G.K. Chesterton could go toe to toe with St. Thomas Aquinas in size, but people that knew the importance of fasting from those things. And I can tell you, I have a close priest friend who's already started. He said he's given up all alcohol until Christmas. All right.
Wow.
Not because he has a problem, it's just because he realizes the importance of kind of not just giving your palate that rest, but the
Hmm.
importance of offering something up. Okay. And then the joy of returning to that, the
Right.
joy of understanding. And not only that, it's a reminder to us, especially, and I learned this from the monks at Clear Creek over 20 years ago, is, they do the monastic fast. They start on September 14th and they go until Easter. There's no
Right. They're
break
already
even.
doing it right now.
They're doing it right now. They take no break even in Christmas. And the abbot, who was at the time only the prior, he said something that has always stuck with me. He says, because they're French in origin, Clear Creek, is that, the cooks put on this great meal at Easter. And he says, and we realize we can't eat it all. Okay. Their stomach shrunk, and it just shows them, okay, even for monks, sometimes the excess that they can engage in when it comes to eating and drinking. All right. And that just reminder that when Easter comes is, oh, I'm getting fuller faster than normal. that's actually a good thing. That's a reminder to us, all right, that we we have to realize that it's important to have both the celebration and the fasting together. Okay. And I'd love you to speak on this a little bit here. You love to just refer to fasting as really joy, okay, not sorrow. Why is that?
Well, I mean, something you just said is something I've said many times too in our fellowship group and to others on other shows. And there can be no feast without a fast, because how do you have these great feast days? How do we have Easter and Christmas? And what brings that true joy out is the fact that you've been going through a fast for so long. You have longing, and you're there finally. If you don't have that, it's all the same. Like the secular world is going to have Christmas decorations up and everything's going to be Christmas until Christmas, and then it's gone, and then it's winter, and then you're just waiting for the next thing, and there's no highs and lows. It's all the same. It's almost like a communist mentality of everything's the same, so nothing special. But when you have fasting, then you can have feasting, and that's what makes it so much more important. I remember I read a survey results some years ago. I think it was during this research on fasting, and it compared what the top three holidays are right now for Americans versus the top three holidays for Americans in like the 1950s. And while Christmas is still ranking highly in both lists, for instance, Halloween is now in the top three. It was not in the top three in 1950. But the second or the first number one holiday back in 1950, which is not in the current list, is Easter, because you can truly appreciate Easter so much more, and that joy of feeling like you are part of the resurrection too, when you can finally go back to eating normal meals, different times of the day, eating what you want, celebrating. There's nothing to be compared with that joy. If you're not fasting, you're really robbing yourself of that eventual joy. Even on Christmas too, at midnight mass, and you're celebrating there at that moment that God himself became man and he was born on this day in a stable in Bethlehem. You are celebrating as well the end of a fast and the ability to feast again. So, how much more special that truly is when you live that life. Otherwise, yes, you'll look forward to seeing family, you'll have the gift exchanges, you'll have dinner, but the joy of the fast is now over. Now we feast. That is truly indicative of a Catholic life worth living.
Well, and not only that, if you take a look at the octaves, all right, um, traditionally the Christmas octave is actually not a major octave compared to Pentecost, Easter. Those are the two highest, and then even Epiphany and Corpus Christi. Um, Christmas is really the same rank as the Ascension octave. And you see, even in the Christmas octave, the Feast of the Holy Innocents, where traditionally the priest wore violet, not red, not white, not gold. He wore violet. And then you have January 5th, the Vigil of Epiphany, which again was traditionally a day of fast, even though it is in the quote unquote Christmas season. And
Hmm.
I put that in scare quotes because it's only recently that the church has adopted the term Christmas season. It was really just octave after octave leading up to the Epiphany, with the one day, January 5th, kind of being out there by itself as the vigil. But even within the Pentecost octave, which again holds the same rank as the Easter octave, every day of that week is Pentecost. That is when the
Hmm.
summer ember days happen. So that
Right.
even in the joy and glory of Pentecost, the church is reminding Catholics that you have to get back to fasting now, because the Roman tradition was that you did not fast during the 40 days of
Right.
Easter. You abstained on the rogation days, but you did
Hmm.
not fast. And that was very much a Roman tradition. Now, we could talk about there's other parts of the church because, ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Plese loves finding a diocese in France that no longer exists that did some type of fasting for 3 years, and he just clings to it. I'm not kidding you. All
This
right.
was
But the
robust
Roman,
research for the book.
yes, but the Roman tradition was that there was no fasting. And then, but in Pentecost, in that week of celebration, It was the church telling people, now you have to get back to fasting. Now you have to start preparing. Now you have to get ready for Corpus Christi. Now you have to get ready for Peter and Paul and John the Baptist and all the vigils that come with that. And I really do wish, and thank God for not only your research, but the research of Dr. Peter Kwasniewski of just delving deep into finding these customs, finding the reasons why this was like this, because it started to get abolished in the 1950s. Where if you look at the 1962, yes, it's the traditional mass. Yes, it's the traditional calendar, but so much has been taken out. And I just want to say, Matthew, if you could send us the links for your books, for your websites,
Yes.
and we'll make sure to put them in the show notes where people could get them. Preferably not Amazon, but if it's only Amazon, that's fine, because as Catholics, we try to avoid Amazon as best as possible. But keep that in mind. Also, I just want to say, as we come to the end of this, and I'm going to give you the last word before I do the closing, but I do want to just say thank you. You're also known as the Catholic CPA. Not
Mhm.
only are you my personal CPA, you helped me a lot when running the coalition and reminding me that I'm not a complete idiot, as so many people, uh, especially the current board, wanted to make me out to be, that I didn't know what I was talking about. You were always that guiding light saying, no, this is perfectly fine. No, this is great. This is how you should be doing things. So I wanted to just publicly thank you for that. I know I privately thanked you, but as
Thank
we
you.
get Hope in the Desert up and running, and as we have unprofitable servants now taking the place of the coalition, I do want to thank you. Any last words, any words of advice that you would like to give to the audience?
Yeah, something that you said earlier, Father, but before I do that, I want to thank you because not only do you talk about these topics, you actually live them. You talk about the pre-1962 missal, the pre-55 missal, that is, and you embody it and you live it, and you talk about these forgotten vigils and these octaves, and it is not just an intellectual exercise; it is a life that you live and that you encourage people to do. And I know you're not just doing this for the show here. I was personally with you when you encourage other people to do St. Martin's Lent many different times before, last year, in the years beforehand too. So you personally live it out. So that means so much that you're not just there saying one thing but doing something else. That you're a man of integrity who actually lives out what you teach from the pulpit. So that means a lot. So thank you for doing that because it makes
Well,
the life too of people like me easier. Because I'm saying I got all this research of how the faith used to be practiced and people are like, well, nobody lives it now. I'm like, well, nobody but Father Lovell. He's one of the few remaining.
I did say you were going to have the last word on the subject before the closing, but I will add, sorry, audience, I have to do this to Matthew, but we had a tradition going of celebrating Martin Mass together, and sadly, we're not doing that this year, and it is completely 100% your fault. So I just want to let you know that. So, but it was always the Saint Martin Bass Thanksgivings were always great, whether it was in
Yeah.
Indiana or where I am now, and I really do appreciate that. But, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you to Matthew Plese for joining us today. You will see down in the show links many places to go, including 1 Peter 5 to join the Fellowship of St. Nicholas. Timothy Flanders is one of the founders of Pelican Plus, so we thank him very much for that. I'd also like to thank very much the Restoring Christian Culture Initiative and my producer, excuse me, Matthew 70 for doing such an excellent job. Until next time, God bless.